Thank you, Antonio, very much for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm very happy to be here and participate in this first consortium. I think it should go well, and if it goes well, then it will be done again and again and again. So ideally, you will be the first generation. You're the guinea pigs too, so you better not behave very well. Okay, so Antonio was telling me about what is it that you want to talk about. So I said nothing in particular, but so what I've decided to do something that may be helpful to you. Antonio was kind of asking me, think about the way you do research, what you do in research, and tell us about it. So what I did is I tried to put together a series of papers that I have been doing with several of my co-authors, Laporta, Schleifer, Vishny, and Genaoli, all of these guys. We have put a series of papers together in the last couple of decades. And they all have, or most of them have, a common thread. The common thread is that we like to sort of gather new data and create new data sets. And sometimes they're very unexpected. Okay, so I will try to show you a little bit and tell you a little bit about the stories behind each of these things, that some of them you may know, some of them you may not know because they're, bad papers, but some of them, they may resonate a little bit, and then, hopefully you get to see that sometimes you find something that you never thought you would find, or that you stumble upon something that you never had a clue about. And that more or less is the story of, of institutions. And then what we're now working on more heavily is about human capital, and in particular, the human capital of the entrepreneurs, okay? So let me try to see if I can put this together. So I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about the measurement of the impact of institutions, which is sort of like a first generation of stuff that we did, and tell you about how we went about gathering this data, thinking about these research ideas, and then something about what we're working on, what we're working on for the last 5 years or so. It's about, again, another massive data collection effort, but now trying to put together some idea about human capital, and in particular CEO education. Now, since we're in finance, we'll probably want to talk a little bit about that. And I will show you a couple of papers, recent papers that we have, that give you some ideas about how we go about trying to create something to get at these questions. Okay. So let me start by talking about the measurement of the impact of institutions. I'm going to be going pretty fast. But I'll have a lot of pictures, okay, so you can see more or less what they are. So this is the picture that started this first wave. This is what we can now call legal origins, okay, which we had absolutely no clue about. We had no clue about when we started working on it. So back in 1994, 1995, some of us were working together at that point at Harvard, and then sort of like we said, the capital markets are very different. They seem to have, the depth of capital markets seems to be very, very different across countries. And we saw most of us were not Americans, so we thought that there may be something about the institutions of finance that may impact this. So we went to Harvard Law School, the International Harvard Law School Library, and we started codifying laws. Okay, just reading all the corporate laws and all the bankruptcy laws. And then we found out that as you start codifying laws, you start by reading the introduction of these laws, and then you find out that they start by telling you, well, this code was inspired, this commercial code is inspired in the Napoleonic Code of 1802, and so on and so forth. You read that for Brazil, and then you move on, and then you open the laws of Indonesia, and then he says, well, the first code is inspired, on the old Dutch code that comes from the Napoleonic Codes of 1804, and so on and so forth. And then we found out that, in fact, that's precisely legal families, or what we now call legal origins. So this is, if you classify the world around who they got their laws from, okay, who they copied the laws from, you find these families, okay, which is, common law, which is everything in yellow, which comes from England, okay, and then there's civil law. The rest of the world is civil law. Civil law depends on the codifications. You can call the rest civil law, or you can then codify it as French, which is most of the world. This is Napoleon. So the commercial codes of France are the largest French export. It's not L'Oreal, is it's not wine, is commercial codes. Okay, so you can see everything in orange. So you can see how Napoleon goes to Spain, and then Spain owns half of this place of the world, and then boom, you go, and then you have Philippines and and Peru having the same kind of origins of commercial codes and so on. So it's a lot of accidents by history. Okay, then you have the Germans. Okay, and then which they don't like the French, and then they sort of they do their own codes, the Bismarck codes, and then the Japanese copied the German codes because it was the newest thing, and they were copying the newest thing in 1998, and then Japan takes over China and Korea, and therefore China has German codes. Okay, then there's the Scandinavians, which are doing their own stuff, freezing up there, but the rest is basically these common legal families. There's 3 or 4 confused individuals which are changing their laws still. If Trump has his way, it's going to be faster than we predict. But you can see that this is mostly exogenous and an accident of history. Okay, so this allowed us to make the exogeneity claim, and this is what was important, that it goes from institutions to markets. So if you have good regulations, good protections of investors, then they will give you money, okay, happier, okay, they will give you money at a lower rate of return, and they will give you more of it, okay, and then therefore markets will grow. So that solves the classic endogeneity problem that we had, in which it's institutions follow laws or laws follow institutions, okay? That is, the other argument would be that, if you have a market, then you protect it. You're not going to protect something that you don't have. So when you have a big market, you invest on it, which is the other argument. So given the legal origins and having this exogenous component of legal origins, we were able to then start creating all of these databases out of the Harvard Library. So we started with this legal origin, and as I said, we started really talking about company laws and bankruptcy laws, but then it moved on into other areas of regulation. So if you look at it, the claim is that legal origin impacts the rules, and the rules that impact the closest market outcomes, okay? So you can see more or less, this is a few of all of these papers. So you have the institutions that we've measured, and each of them is a new procedure to try to go and measure these institutions, okay? So we didn't spend all our life at the Harvard Library. Then we started getting a little better and working with lawyers from around the world and asking them for doing something much more complicated and working with them on it. And each of these measures tends to be a little bit more encompassing. So for example, the last measure that we have on investor protections is about anti-self-dealing, and that takes care of not only company law, also securities laws, but also civil procedures and how it attacks a classic transaction, which is self-dealing, or the main corporate governance problem. So you can see that all of these things fall into 3 buckets. So I have 3 buckets. So what we did is imagine that you try to do a first stage, which we don't do instrumental variables anymore because legal origins now, since it impacts most of this stuff, it's it's going to be very difficult to just say this one's, okay? But it is undeniable that it has an impact on this. And then you can see that we see the impacts in a first stage regression. You would see the impact of the legal origins on this, and then you can see how the rules affect it. So let's take bucket number 1. This is some examples. And each of these measures that you're going to see, these are partial scatter plots. So that is residual. Okay, so controlling for, imagine that you control for GDP per capita and efficiency of the judicial system and other things that you may want to. This is the impact of the measure of laws. So in this case will be the regulation against self-dealing, and you can see how the net impact of this affects the size of stock markets as a proportion of the economy. So in order to create a measure, this is a measure that you go and you develop, working with, we work with a top law firm in each country, and we created this index, and then, so that's how we worked on it. And then this is creditor rights. So this is the original creditor rights. It's like how creditors are protected through bankruptcy laws by looking at the laws, and you can see how the more protection to these 2 types of investors, the better they're going to be. Okay, so the bucket number 1, and this is how we started, is like trying to measure financial institutions. Then we moved to bucket number 2, which is trying to measure business regulation in general. So firms are not only about finance, they may also care about other things. And here's when we measure the regulation of entry. You may know this. Some of these indices the World Bank has been reproducing now every year. or a crappier version of this. Okay, so a less sophisticated version, if you will. This is one that the Doing Business report reproduces, which is, what are the steps that you need to open up a business, a small business in a country, okay? And you can see that, so with this idea about, how do you go about opening up a business? So what we did is, through the World Bank offices everywhere, we sent someone to go through the process of opening up a business in a certain small industry, okay? And then we codified the steps, we codified the costs, and then with these measures, then you get, something of this. And this shows you that, regulating entry in the end ends up like not being very good for stopping corruption. So this is lack of corruption, for example. So you can see that the more you regulate, the more corruption you're going to have, because what you're doing is you're stopping people at the door or knocking on many doors. And in fact, it doesn't end up, it ends up sending people in the informal economy, okay, that way. So this is business regulation. Another massive codification. Let's talk about labor laws. We are not labor economists at all. So we had to get our hands around labor. And then, so we designed, what we did is we designed, so we codified some of the laws, but we also designed some idea of the experiment that says, imagine that you're a firm and that you want to, you get a demand shock and you need to fire, okay, 20% of your employment force. How would you go about it? How restrictive the law is? Imagine, so that's one subindex, let's say. So what you need to do to go and fire these people, can you or can you not at all? Okay, another one would be, imagine that you're a firm and now you receive a positive shock. Okay, now you want to hire 20% more. How can you go about it? Okay, and we codify the laws around these kind of experiments, if you will. So that's how we sort of like recreated data. So around some experiments, okay, or some ideas about how to approach the cost of business, of doing business. This is how we create these things. And these are obviously very, very controversial graphs in France, okay? So controversial that you shouldn't repeat this, okay? But that the French tried to boycott the Doing Business report in the World Bank for a few years, okay? Just to get rid of this measure, okay? So that it doesn't get collected anymore, because obviously don't look great. Okay, so what you observe here is that more regulation of entry ends up, throwing people out of participation in the labor force. Unemployment rates, are higher, and particularly the unemployment rates of the youth. Okay, so it's the young that are paying for the regulation that protects the old and the unions. Okay, that kind of idea. Okay, again. Then let's go to bucket number 3, and I will finish with the impact of institutions there. Bucket number 3 is about, judicial institutions that try to protect, okay, firms, not only, through the courts, okay, and also from the government itself, okay? So here we designed one that is called civil procedural formalism. This is a funny one. So this is a paper that's called Court. So what we did is, so the inside story of that one is that my parents have an apartment that they wanted to rent in Mexico City, so they rented it, they thought, to a very nice person, okay? And it took them 6 years to get rid of that very nice person who never paid, okay? And you would say, well, I have a brother who's a lawyer, he's supposed to be a fantastic lawyer and a fantastic law firm. Well, it took us 6 years to get them out. And when we got them out, they had taken the toilets, everything, the floor, everything that you can dream of, okay? So this is what we codified here, is how do you go about, how formalistic is the procedure to go about kicking out a non-paying tenant, okay? So that's how we went around doing that. Then we did another one, which is more financing, which how would you go about trying to collect on an unpaid check from a supplier, okay? So this is, more or less what you see, and you see again these are all partial scatter plots, residuals, okay? So this is like the clean effect. Again, you see how, formalism or inflexibility of the legal system ends up like not being very good. It ends up leading you to a long time to collect on claims. And in fact, you would say, well, like the German reaction to this graph is, we don't care if it takes forever, but we want to get it right, okay? Well, the people that consume justice actually do care about time. So contract enforcement, the opinion of people on contract enforcement is also bad, okay? So in this first iteration, we said, listen, doing business is about, we measure this institutional impact, and we gather different ways of looking at it, okay? And it's all by going about and creating a new data set and doing something out of it. This has a little bit of a problem because once you create a data set, then you can only use it once. So we're very bad. We are very, very bad at reusing the same data set. We've never done it, okay? So we're not very good at it, okay? Except for the law of finance indices, which were 2 twin papers at the same time. We've never been able to do 2 of the same. So probably you can do better. If you collect your data, you should be able to exploit it a lot more, but we're never able to do that, okay? I think we get so bored about collecting the data that we don't want to touch it, with a 10-foot pole for the next 5 years, okay? Good. So that was the first section. So we said, institutions matter, okay? And what do I have, 10 minutes? Or how much? You tell me, okay? I can do this fast, very fast, or triple fast. You tell me. So we have institution matters, 20. Okay, I can go triple slow. Okay? So institutions matter, so rules tend to matter. Okay? And this is how we went about collecting that. And this links, conceptually and theoretically, that this origin of institutions sometimes is, and this is, all the work that we've done, but so to give you a conceptual framework, sometimes the inefficiency of the institutions that we observe, because it's a puzzle that we are in such a level of inefficiency of institutions, right, across countries, when you could kind of copy, if you will, okay? So sometimes the forces of inefficiency are politics, and there's a ton of people that have worked on politics before, so we worked on it just a little. But sometimes this inefficiency comes from transplantation of laws, and therefore the legal origin graph that we talked about at the beginning, which gives you some hope because you don't need to stick to the Napoleonic protection of creditors, if you are sitting in Argentina in the year 2020. I mean, you can try to reform, so Chileans have. So why would Argentinians not be able to do it, right? So but this gives you some idea about reform. And then there is an agenda about how people do reforms, and then people have been trying to measure changes in institutions and see how they do reform and so on. Okay, but we haven't done a lot of that, and this is what we said tends to be a little bit of overregulation. And this sort of I don't want to say careful measurement, but I would like to say this distilled measurement, or this breaking up of the components of regulation may give you an idea, sort of like a light, about a blueprint for reform, okay? What can you change? Now, let's not get overexcited, because since we know that legal origin has an impact on a ton of stuff, it's not like you go and you change 3 things and you're done. So it's a much harder job, but at least you can see some of these things that seem to have an impact, and some of the things that may be easier to change than others that are not very political, okay? That may not go through political processes, or that don't depend on justice, for example, okay? So that's kind of that idea, okay? So I believe that that's what we have learned, but I'm sure that people in this room would disagree, but that's okay, okay? So I believe that this is something that we have learned. So more recently, we have moved on to something, so we said, this cross-country data collections is very boring. Why don't we just, instead of collecting data for 150 countries, why don't we collect data for provinces of each of these 100 countries? So now let's go down to the level of the provinces, okay? So that's the last thing that we did. And the idea behind this is that, yes, institutions impact the cost of doing business, but it is still the case, okay, that we observe within countries and within industry a very large distribution of productivity. So these graphs are not mine. So this is from various papers that people have tried to measure total factor productivity, okay? So this is an incredibly famous graph from the QJE paper. This guy, so you can see that now you're not talking about institutions anymore, because this is within the United States, within a very narrowly defined industry code, and we see that there is, the most productive, the quartile of most productive firms is producing about twice or a little more than the least productive quartile. If you move to emerging markets, okay, or submerging markets, whatever you want to call them, you can see that this gets to be 3 or 5 times. So it's about 3 times in China and 5 times in China, the differences in productivity. So yes, institutions may be something, but there may be something else that is explaining this missing component, okay? This unexplained component of productivity differences across firms within the same industry codes, within the same country, okay? So with this idea, we said, well, let's go into a massive data collection. So this is the new map, okay? So now in this map, what we did is we try to say, let's go at the provincial level, okay? So here for Spain, you will see, the kind of data we have, okay? And then, so in the United States will be the states, okay? And so on. So we're going to go and try to collect data at the provincial level, okay? And then we're going to collect data on firms in each province, okay? So what we did is we try to gather data about, you will see the variables, okay? So we have data for about, 96% of the world GDP. Obviously, we're not doing very good in terms of surface because, green, here this guy, is a bit disruption, okay? But it proved incredibly hard to collect data for some African countries because, most of the data, many times we had to ask ministries to produce the data for us because the data didn't match the aggregation on other kind of data. So we asked them to reproduce data for us and so on and so forth. So the data that you will see is about 110 countries. After that, I managed to collect another 22 of them from Africa, but we didn't redo the paper, okay? But the data is kind of like also available for 130 something countries, okay? So this is kind of like the data that we have. So now we said, again, we want to create some new database. And here what we did is we try to gather. So now we have about 1,500 regions, okay? So it's most important data. We wanted to get data on education and on income, okay? GDP, regional GDP and regional education, if you will, okay? So then, but we also say, what may determine productivity? It may also be geography. So there's a bunch of other theories. Geography, think about, Jeffrey Sachs and so on, or endowments, okay? So we collected data on average temperatures. These are the best variables, by the way. Inverse distance to coast, oil reserves, but we have all kinds of minerals and so on. So these are the variables that have the biggest impact. And we did that through, now there's, you guys are high tech, so now there's all of these maps, the satellites maps, and then they map all of that stuff, so it's incredibly cute. Okay, so now it requires a little bit more high tech than going to the Harvard Law Library. Okay, so, but we get there, okay, although we're getting old. Then we also collected some data of institutions at the regional level. So you can see some of the institutions, which is access to finance, they're doing business report at the regional level, paying taxes, corruption, all of that stuff, okay? Because that's another theory, the institutional theory. Then we have infrastructure. This is another big determinant of productivity. It depends on the infrastructure that you may have. Of course, if you have very big infrastructure, that makes you much more productive, okay? Then some cultural values, okay? So it goes from the level of trust, civic values, also ethno-linguistic fractionalization and all of that stuff that people have been working on recently, okay? So that also may impact productivity because if you don't trust each other, you're not going to be, producing very effectively and so on. And then, of course, data on population and so on at the regional level. So we have data for all of that stuff for these guys. Okay, so with that data, then we say, okay, can we try to explain a little better the differences in income? And this will be the impact, again, partial scatter plots, controlling for a bunch of stuff, of years of education on income per capita at the provincial level. So if you can take it at the country level, and you can see how the average education, okay, and this is average number of years of schooling in the province, okay? So you get the average number of years of education in the province. This is the most data that we can get for all of these countries. For, for a subset, about 60 or 80 countries, we'll have, more refined data about going to graduate school or going to, and so on, university and so on, okay? But you can see how it impacts it quite a bit. This is with Brazil, for example, which I should scratch out of my slides because it beat Mexico in soccer, so I will cross that out. Here is Colombia, okay? So, and then India and the one who's gonna win the cup, okay? So you can see how it kind of like maps. Now if you put all of the provinces together of all of the countries, you get this kind of graph. Okay, this is the net effect of education, controlling for all of these geography dummies, which are a big explainer of differences within country and on population, which of course is important. And you can see that we have about 1,500 observations for years of education. And then how much does education explain of the R-squared between countries? You can see that it's very, very big. Okay, education is very, very big. So education, average education explains a lot of the differences in productivity across countries, between countries. But so do institutions, let's say, for example, informal payments or trust. So they explain a big chunk. But once you get to within countries, it sounds like it's education that just beats everything. The rest just washes away. So a big component is education, okay? So, so you can imagine that in order to get there, we had to collect a ton of data to sort of like be able to get to this controversial or, whatever point, okay? Now, if you run some regressions, which I'm not gonna bore you with, you get more or less the same kind of idea. So this is at the regional GDP, geography, and schooling. Okay, so you can see this is the geography. These are the best geography variables, which by themselves, okay, explain about 47% of the differences in productivity across countries and 8% of the differences in productivity within countries, that is within provinces. Now, if you dump education there, okay, if you add education, then this goes from 8 to 42. Actually, it's a little bit of cheating because we also added, labor because of the model that we have. But, but you can see that there's a big jump, okay? And it explains a lot of between, but it explains a lot or within, okay? So education is very big. And this is another way of saying that if you exclude institutions or culture, you basically still have 40% of the R-squared within. If you exclude education, you are bumped down to the 10% levels. So the impact of education is very, very big, okay? So with this, we said, well, the impact of education is very important in our model, which we call the Lucas model, about education, and then, worker education and manager education. We wanted to go and then measure, collect more data about, production at the firm level, because we know where the firms or the plants are located, and then education of the manager and education, the average education of the workers of each plant, of each company. And that's the data that we expanded the data on that. Then we have, so this is at the firm level. So we have about 13 or 15, 20,000 firms for which we collected data. Now the number of countries does go down, so it's not 110. These are the countries where we can have all of this data to create, so also we can control for expenditure or energy or property, plant, and equipment, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can do it for about 60 countries, you would get more or less the same, but this is like sort of like a better regression. And you see that the education of the workers matters, but the education of the managers matters also quite a bit. So it's a missing factor, if you will. If you do what the macro guys do and you calibrate stuff and you do something, that I don't have any time to talk about. So these are all of the Minserian coefficients on the returns to education and workers here and the CEO. And you see that the returns on education of entrepreneurs is about 5 times as high as the return on education on workers. So educating your manager or having a manager that is educated may be quite, profitable, if you will, okay? Now, we do not know what the managers do, so here's the big area which we have no clue about what is it that these educated managers do better, okay? It's probably that they're better at organizing production, okay? It's probably they're better at motivating, workers. It's probably that they're better at thinking about incentives, or they're just better about copying technologies from successful guys, okay? but there's something that they're better about something, okay? And this is a very big area of research that I think people are doing. You know, Nick Bloom has started to get data for over 20 of them, and this is, but this is 20 countries or 25 countries already, but this is where I think this becomes interesting, okay? So as I said, we were mismeasured the benefits of entrepreneurs and on managers' education. Educated CEOs may be better at doing a bunch of stuff, okay? Not all firms can establish good operational human resources or managerial practices. Maybe they do not have or they cannot afford high human capital of the CEO. Maybe highly educated managers are just better at copying. It's not that they're more creative or they just jump on opportunities faster. We don't know. Now, all of that is incredibly important to know, I think. Now let me tell you another cute data collection. We're trying to get a little bit about, so we went from institutions, then we go into education, then the manager education, and then what is it that these managers do a little bit. So we have a cute paper. It's not rocket science, okay? This is a paper that we published a couple of years ago. It's called Letters, okay? And then we said, a big question was, we talked about the impact of education on firms, but you can think about the government as a firm also. And if you could try to measure the impact of managerial quality or education on this government, the firm, maybe that would be interesting. So we went back to Prescott, who thought that the postal services would be a very good example of productivity in the government, and which is very cute because it's not about, there's other theories about why governments are inefficient, right? It's, it's about corruption, we just talked about that, or it's about only having, top guys that are educated and then the rest not, or, politics or special groups' interests or whatever you want. But so we designed an experiment that was trying to get away from that by going to the post office. So we did. We found this incredible data set for the Postal Union, the World Postal Union, which I had no clue about. But these guys collect data back since the 1970s about post offices around the world for about 160 countries. And you know the number of workers at each place, the technology of the machine that they use to read the letters. I mean, it's insane, okay? The number of letter boxes in each place. I mean, it's just, ridiculous, okay? So we used that data and we found something in the code. They have this code that says when you send a letter and you cannot find the person on the other side, then the letter needs to be returned so they sign some regulation, these 159 countries, that says you need to return the letter within 3 months, and the country that pays for the postage back is the sender country. So we said we want to make the gringos pay, so what we did is we sent 10 letters from Harvard Square to 5 different cities, so 2 letters to each city so that we could instrument one with the other, okay? At 2 different times. To the 5 largest cities, we sent 10 letters with the wrong name. This is the name of a dead economist, okay? So this is the name of a dead economist. And then we send it to a road with the wrong number, okay? And so this is, for example, the letter. So we sent 10 in 2 batches, 5 and 5, to the 5 different cities. And then, Rafael Laporta religiously, because he never travels, so he goes religiously every day to his office. At that time it was at Harvard, not at Brown, so office at Harvard, and saw all the letters that returned back as they were supposed to, and then he would write the date. So this is the Lapo date. Okay, so we knew when we sent it, and we knew when it came back. Okay? And this is how we're going to try to measure government efficiency. And all that the letter has is it has a piece of paper that says, hey, here I am, we talked about a research project, are we ready to work, okay? So you could not steal anything, or there was no reason why the letter wouldn't come. At some point we thought about sending a dollar bill to see where it got stolen, but then, it was gonna disappear very fast. We thought about sending a package with a GPS, but then we investigated, and the longest the GPS could last was 40 days, the battery, so that was not gonna work. So you see, it's all about designing your experiment. So we ended up doing this one, okay? And you can see that there's the letter backs, This is, for example, 2 countries at the top and at the bottom of the distribution. So here is the Czech Republic. So we sent the letter in 2010, okay? The letter was received back in 2011, and we waited until 2012 to see if all the letters arrived. So in the Czech Republic, all the letters got back, and the letters got back within 90 days, which is the international convention. So they get a perfect 100%, and they took 52 days to come back. Okay, these are the addresses. Here is Russia, okay? So we sent all the letters, none of them came back. Okay, so we waited for 118 days, and then we said we got to stop at some point. Okay, so you can see the very big differences here. It was so big that somebody actually ran a 1-hour TV program on this table in Russia, in Moscow 1. And there were babushkas crying that their letters were lost, and cats roaming through the packages, and so on and so forth. So so that was quite funny. Okay, so you see, this is not rocket science. It was just kind of like a cute experiment to try to get back at this question: what is it that determines government efficiency? Think about government as a firm. Okay, so there's going to be some factors to productivity, and then we're going to get to managerial quality also. Okay. So for the 159 countries, we got 60% of the letters back, only a third in time, okay? And it took an average of 220 days, okay? That's how long we waited, okay? You can see that countries that have higher education levels tend to do better, okay? So we're gonna control for that. Since we have a lot of data on the mail of each country, so we were able to create like a production function of the post office. And then you can see, so this is, did I let the letter back? Did I get the letter back in 90 days, the number of days? And this is, the logarithm of letterboxes per staff, the postcode database, that is the machine that reads, other things, that you can control for. So this is like the production function, some of the determinants. And on top of that, then we threw in managerial quality as best as we could measure it throughout. We obviously threw in education, but I think I didn't bring in the education slide. That was not very smart of me. Okay, we threw in education. Education obviously does matter, but it's also this idea about the managers and what they do that may have an impact. So here we have the production function, and we see these are will to delegate, that is managers that delegate more, okay? Innovation, quality of management schools, so this is very nice because then you can see at least, management schools do something a little vague. And then this is some of the countries. This is the countries go down to about 20 because that's all that Bloom has. He has data about managerial monitoring programs, targets, and incentives at the plant level within 20 countries. And you can see that it have, monitoring and targets, have very, very big impact. Okay? So this is, for example, the class graphs that come out of that graph. So you can see that it has a very, very big impact on productivity of the post office. So you can think about organizing a government is just like organizing a firm to a large extent. Perhaps part of the productivity differences or the inefficiency of government can also be explained with this finance or business perspective, okay? So I finished with this. So I think that what we have is through this data, we have sort of like started to say institutions matter, but they're not all. Education may be important, okay? Many countries have similar institutions, but they're very different in human capital. And we probably need to think in the next generation about the right human capital. This is the entrepreneurial capital. Not that the worker capital is bad, but we probably don't give too much weight to the entrepreneurial capital. Okay? So that's more or less how we go about doing this. Thank you very much.